Hi everybody, we're the little more than a week after Paysach. I hope everyone had a wonderful, inspirational holiday. I know it was a little isolated, but hopefully all of you felt the presence of Hashem and the presence of the family, even if they could not be with you in body. They were certainly with you in spirit. Today we're meeting at a somewhat different location because of the coronavirus. I decided to stay put, and Rabbi Poston was kind enough to come to me. So I'm speaking from the conference room of Yeshivat or Somayach, which is not only a nice commercial for my yeshiva, but right in back of me, you can see the picture of the namesake of the yeshiva, the great Rabbi and Tzaddik, Rabbi Meir Simcha HaKohen, the Rabbi of Dvinsk, who died in the 1920s. And the yeshiva was named after him. He and his Rebbetzin did not merit to have any children, but he was a great, great influence on Klal Yisrael, and that influence continues to this very day. And I hope that he will guide me to try to say something that's meaningful and inspiring at this very difficult time. This is a challenging time, and I know that you yourselves might be tired of even talking about the coronavirus. I will not talk about the coronavirus tonight. However, it happens to be connected, at least peripherally, to the topic of the parsha that I will talk about, so I'll try to make a connection to our contemporary situation. The parsha that we're reading about really has two topics. Topic number one are the various korbanot, the various sacrifices that a woman must bring after childbirth. And interestingly enough, one would expect that those sacrifices would be in the nature of thanksgiving offerings. In fact, they are not. The dominant korban that a woman brings after childbirth is a sin offering, and one wonders what exactly is the sin. And Rashi offers an interesting interpretation that labor pains can be so intense that a woman might swear she never wants to have kids again, so as a result there would have to be a sin offering. That itself is a very interesting thing to ponder, the notion that birth, the bringing of new life into the world, is preceded by pain and suffering. Now all of us know that was not God's original plan, but as a result of the sin of Adam and Eve eating from the fruit of the Garden of Eden, one of the consequences that God decreed was, number one, that death comes into the world, and number two, that women will suffer in birth. So although that wasn't, as it were, the ultimate ideal, that is the reality, that the generation of life must be preceded by a great deal of suffering. The reason this is interesting is because our sages use the same analogy for the messianic process. The messianic process, which is described as bringing new life into the world, vitality, redemption, renewal, will be, according to our tradition, preceded by a series of cataclysmic events. And in fact, the term that the rabbis employed for those cataclysmic events is Chavlei Mashiach, which literally means the birth pains of Mashiach. Now the Rambam already tells us that we really should not get involved in trying to identify which types of events are Chavlei Mashiach and which are not, because we'll only know that in retrospect. Once Mashiach comes, we'll be able to point out this step and that step. So obviously, anyone who claims any type of certain knowledge about the messianic sequence is basically very foolish, because we don't have prophets today. But one needs to keep in mind that cataclysmic events are not limited to wars. They can include the devastating impact of a virus, a kind of a silent enemy or a microscopic enemy, which drives us into our homes, which creates panic and fear, which devastates not only by reason of the illness, but by reason of the reaction, the cataclysmic impact on the economy, the losses of business, the costs of social isolation, and the like. So if there's any silver lining to kind of the dark cloud that the world faces, perhaps we should think of the analogy of childbirth, which is preceded by labor pains And so too the Messianic era is preceded by those labor pains. It is certainly my prayer, and I'm sure it's a prayer that all of us share, that as difficult as this time is, may it be the Chavlei Mashiach, may it be the birth pains that will lead to the redemption and to the light of Mashiach. I made the point earlier, I guess it's worthy to repeat a little bit, that one of the ways we bring Mashiach is when we forsake our ego and we recognize our helplessness, and we realize how much without God we cannot do anything. And initially that's very uncomfortable and that's very frightening. But at some point when a person realizes that we are not the masters of our fate, there can be something enormously comforting in knowing that God is essentially in charge of the car, in charge of the vehicle, and will take us to the destination we need to go. And that too is part of why this is the Messianic process. Now that is only the first topic of the parsha, and that's the smaller topic of the parsha, the Yoledet, the woman who gives birth. But then the bulk of the parsha deals in great detail that is quite complicated and quite technical, about a malady that is known as tsarat. The standard translation of tsarat is leprosy, but the tsarat of the Torah does not at all correspond to the disease that used to be called leprosy. Now it's not even called that, Hansen's disease. The leprosy of the Torah, the tsarat of the Torah, is a skin condition. Interestingly enough, the closest word to tsarat, which actually resembles the condition of tsarat, is psoriasis, which is a Greek word. And tsarat is a skin condition in which part of the skin turns white, and we'll talk about what that means in a moment. However, tsarat comes in at least three varieties. There is tsarat of the person, which is essentially a white discoloration of the flesh. There is tsarat of a garment, which develops a type of mold or fungus. And there is even tsarat of the bayit, and for each of a house. And in all of these situations, the Torah prescribes a very detailed ritual, followed by purification rites, until the tsarat goes away, which may be a short amount of time, may be a very long amount of time, and it may be never. Theoretically, although I imagine it was rare, a person could remain a mitzorah forever, for the rest of their lives. The first point to keep in mind is that although, let's talk about tsarat of a person primarily, although tsarat is indeed a physical manifestation of discoloration of the flesh, so it certainly is something in the person's body, it is not regarded in our tradition as a medical condition. Indeed, it is not treated as a contagious disease, because it is not. According to our rabbis, according to Chazal, tsarat is essentially a message from God that the individual that is afflicted has a spiritual blemish that they must endeavor to rectify. And Chazal differentiate what that blemish might be. In the case of tsarat of the person, the primary blemish, the rat that is inside, which manifests itself as a skin condition, is lashon hara, derogatory speech, even if true, about other people, malicious gossip, which is really kind of an outgrowth of either indifference towards other people or actively hating them or the like. In fact, Chazal say the very word for leper highlights the nature of the sin. Mitzorah can be read as a combination word, motzi ra, he who brings out bad or negative thoughts about other people. So as a result, tsarat, although it manifests itself as a physical condition, is essentially a warning to the person to rectify his ways and try to do tshuva, repentance, for the sin of lashon hara. The Gemara in Erchin goes on and says that if tsarat of the person is because of lashon hara, tsarat of the garments is a punishment because of gasut haruach, because of arrogance and conceit. A person often takes pride in the way they dress, etc., and if one is overly arrogant, haughty, lacks humility, so that saras of the garment says that we're kind of too big for our britches, as the expression goes. And finally, sarat of the bayit, which Chazal actually say never happened, it was a theoretical construct, comes from selfishness and a lack of concern for others, because one of the things you have to do when the house has this leprosy is every single thing in the house has to be removed from the house and placed in public view. So if you were a person, if somebody needed hospitality, somebody needed a meal, you said, sorry, I don't have any extra food, I don't have any extra clothing, well, all of that would have to be exposed so people would see that indeed you had the resources to help people and you didn't. So b'kitzur, tzarat of the body, lashon hara, tzarat of the garment, gasut ruach, arrogance, tzarat of the bayit, tsarut oyen, selfishness, lack of concern for others. That's kind of a general introduction. But the bulk of my remarks, I want to focus on the most common sarat. Again, sarat was probably never common, but relatively speaking, the most common sarat is sarat of the person that comes because of lashon hara. Lashon hara is something that many people don't always take very seriously. You know the old saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. But we know how untrue that is. The power of speech is awesome. Speech, words, can destroy, they can devastate. They can create psychic pain for which a person may never recover. I remember hearing Richard Nixon being interviewed years after he left the presidency in disgrace because of Watergate. So this man had certainly been through the ringer and put us through the ringer. Although in many ways he actually was a very good president for Israel, but that's a talk for another time. And yet, this man, who was the only president of the United States to ever resign, because otherwise he would have been removed from office after impeachment, what he could not stop talking about were the 6th grade insults that he remembers hearing as a kid in school. That bothered him, and that in some sense motivated him his entire life. So you could blame Watergate and Vietnam and all sorts of things on those taunts. So part of what the Mitzorah has to realize, and part of what we have to realize, is that words are very, very far from harmless. Words can destroy. Words can be like daggers that pierce a heart. But at the same time, words have the capacity to give comfort, to give love, to strengthen people in their times of weakness. And we have to look at our speech as something holy, something elevated, and try to endeavor to use our speech, of course, for prayer, for Torah learning, but also to give people encouragement and strength, to build people up instead of cutting them down. And then we have learned the lesson of the Mitzorah. In point of fact, it's been pointed out that this is why there are certain aspects of the Mitzorah ritual that are connected to this. For example, one of the things you will notice when you study all of the leprosy provisions is the key role that a Kohen plays. When a person has this skin blemish, he must go to the Kohen. And just like baseball umpires say, you know, it's not a ball or a strike until I call it a ball or a strike. Tzarat is not tzarat unless the Kohen proclaims it to be so. This is very different than a medical condition. A person has cancer whether the doctor called it cancer or not. That's why people sometimes say, I don't want to go to the doctor, I'm afraid what he'll discover. Well, sorry, you know, if it's there, it's there. Tzarat actually isn't that way. Until the Kohen proclaims, one is not a Mitzorah. And as a result, the Gemara actually says there are certain days where Kohanim are not allowed to proclaim a person as Mitzorah because that will take away the joy of the occasion. A Kohen does not proclaim Mitzorah on Shabbos or on Yom Tov or a Chol HaMoed or for the 7 days following a wedding, which are days of celebration. And by the way, Maimonides makes the point, this is very, very clear, therefore, that sarat is not a contagious disease. If that would be the case, it would make no sense to defer the quarantine until after the Sheva Brachos. If anything, we'd have to stop it right away, just as we're doing now. We would have a Zoom Sheva Bracha to whatever maybe a balcony Sheva Bracha to whatever the equivalent would have been years ago. So the Kohen is the one that makes it or breaks it. And there are two important lessons that are connected to this idea of Lashon Hara. Number one, you see from the Kohen himself the power of speech. Speech creates the realities. His statement, "You are a Mitzorah," makes the reality of Mitzorah. And his statement, "You're not a Mitzorah," takes away that reality. So the Mitzorah sees in his own person the power of speech to create realities. That's lesson number one. Lesson number two, of course, is that the Kohen is an exemplar, as Pirkei Avot says, of Aaron, who's the prototypical Kohen. Aaron is described in Pirkei Avot as the Ohev Shalom, the lover of peace, the pursuer of peace. Aaron loved, Aaron reconciled. The one who speaks Lashon Hara is indifferent, is callously indifferent to the harm that is inflicted on reputations, on family, on feelings, on communities. He misuses his speech to destroy instead of build up. His penance is to attach himself to the Kohen, who represents the utilization of speech for Ohev Shalom, for Rodef Shalom. A final aspect of the Mitzorah is that for the duration of his Sarat, he actually is put in quarantine. He has to be chutz l'machaneh, out of the camp. He is all by himself. And here the lesson is, number one, we're not quarantining him because he has a contagious virus. But on the other hand, there is something that is contagious, and that is gossip, Lashon Hara. That it is so dangerous, it is so pernicious, it is so destructive, that we have to isolate it. Because that's the cancer. The cancer is not the skin condition, but the cancer is the destructive power of speech. But there's another aspect to the quarantine, not just to protect the public, but for the Mitzorah to experience in microcosm the pain that he may have inflicted on others. Lashon Hara can break up families, can create hatred. Let the Mitzorah experience what it's like to be alone. Let the Mitzorah understand how precious and beautiful community and family is. And that in turn will make him think twice before he engages in destructive speech. In some ways, and again I did say I wasn't going to talk about Corona bi'arichut, but I think there's another point about Corona that does emerge here, and I think Rav Chaim Kanievsky actually made the point very early on in the lockdown quarantine process. And he says, in a sense, the quarantine that all of us are going through, again, quarantine technically is not quite a quarantine for most of us, but nevertheless, the isolation that we have is really kind of Mitzorah-like, in the sense that all of us are michutz l'machaneh. A lot of our shuls are closed, our yeshivot are closed. We weren't allowed to kind of have extended family at our Pesach Seder or even for a visit during Chol HaMoed. So all of us were operating, and to some degree still are operating, under conditions of isolation. And maybe the lesson is that just as the Mitzorah is isolated, so he should feel the pain of isolation, and therefore appreciate the importance of community, solidarity, family, and togetherness, and thereby desist from Lashon Hara. So too, perhaps this is an experience that all of us need. I hope and I pray, and again I'm speaking to myself as well, I'm certainly not above this struggle, that when the Batei Knesiyot open up again, when the yeshivas open up again, when we can visit each other, we will cherish what it is that we've lost for a few weeks, and we won't take it for granted anymore. And in that sense, this can be what our sages call Yerida L'tzorech Aliyah. Sometimes going down is preliminary to being able to step up, just like with the ladder. In order to climb up on the ladder, you have to press your foot down. There's a concept in spiritual growth that you sometimes have to experience a descent in order to appreciate the ascent that comes later. Once again, if we have to go through difficult times, then at the very least, let's learn from it. Let's grow from it. Because if we go through difficulties and we don't grow and learn from it, then it's really a waste. L'chala pachot, we can salvage something good, which is always Hashem's intent. All suffering that Hashem brings to the world is so that we learn and that we grow, and not simply just experience the negativity of it. So now I want to focus on something that's quite technical, but I think it has a powerful message. So you're going to have to bear with me for a while. Initially you might be wondering, why am I getting into such detail? But I hope you'll find this relevant. And that is, when a person comes to the Kohen, a person wakes up one morning and a person has a white blotch, and again, it's not what we call psoriasis, it literally is a very bright white, which is somewhat unusual. So remember, he's not a Mitzorah yet, because there's no Kohen. That's why today we wouldn't have that issue. But he goes to the Kohen, and the Kohen inspects it, and the Kohen makes a ruling. Is he a Mitzorah? Is he not a Mitzorah? It depends on color, it depends on size. There are various determinations a Kohen must make. Let's assume the Kohen says he's a Mitzorah. Well, the truth of the matter is, he's not a full-fledged Mitzorah yet. He goes into quarantine, and he's in quarantine for 7 days. On the 7th day, the Kohen re-inspects him, and the Kohen has to determine, is there some additional sign along with the white blotch that is a sign of additional impurity? And the Torah identifies 3 possible signs of additional impurity. One is that there was a black hair, let's say the nega was on his arm, and the black hair within the white splotch of skin turned white. That is siman tuma number 1. Alternative siman tuma is that the splotch expanded, it grew bigger. In other words, it covered a smaller area, and on day 7 it enlarged. That's called pisayon. And the third siman tuma, which might be a little counterintuitive, is that within the nega, within the splotch, there is now some healthy skin. Now, ironically, you might have thought that should be better, but that's considered, again, I'll try to explain this, that's called the siman tuma. So if he has, along with the nega, along with the skin discoloration, the black hair turned white, or the nega expanded, or there is michya, healthy flesh, he then gets graduated, upgraded, or downgraded, as that were. He now becomes a full-fledged Mitzorah who will eventually have to bring sacrifices in the Beis HaMikdash. What if nothing changed? He still has the nega, but he does not have a siman, a sign of tuma. So the Kohen puts him in quarantine for another 7 days. And then at the end of the 2 weeks, the Kohen re-inspects him to see if perhaps a siman tuma developed. By that time, again, the white hair, the expansion of the nega, or the healthy flesh. If there's a siman tuma at that point, he once again gets upgraded to be a full-fledged Mitzorah. But interestingly enough, if at the end of the 2 weeks, he still has the same leprosy he began with, but a black hair did not turn white, or there was no expansion, or there's no healthy flesh, he still has the nega, he is actually sent home, and he no longer has the impurity of tzarat. A lot of people, unless they study the Chumash very carefully, my guess is they wouldn't imagine this. People think you're a leper until the leprosy goes away. Actually, not true. If a siman tuma, it does not augment the nega by day 14, actually it's day 13 because the first of the second week is the same day as the last of the first week, the person is not halachically a mitzorah, the quarantine stops, even though he has the initial symptomology of the nega. Obviously, this is a very, very technical area, and besides the Chumash, which is quite confusing, there's a whole tractate of Mishnah, Maseches Negayim, which is one of the most difficult tractates in the whole Talmud. So I'm not going to go into great detail, but I want to see if we can understand, if we can extract a little bit of a spiritual message from all of these details, because that's really our avoda today. You know, we don't have the ritual of Mitzorah today. Much of it is enigmatic anyway, and it's hard for us to fully understand. By the way, the Ramban makes a beautiful comment that today there are no Mitzoros because Sarat is connected to prophecy. Now, it's a negative prophecy. If I become Mitzorah, I'm not that happy with my situation. But essentially, it is a direct communication from God as to what you have to correct. So therefore, even the negative feedback only exists when there's prophecy. Today, we don't get that type of report card. We have to kind of guess or figure things out. So in a way, Mitzorah, Ramban suggests, was actually part of the gifts of direct communication that God gave us when there was prophecy. Okay, so we don't have that today, and in a sense, the way the Ramban is explaining it, that's kind of a loss for us, actually. But still, is there some type of message that we could extract? So I want to suggest a thought. The basis of the thought is really in the Sefer Hadrash for Ian. The Reisha Rav was a great Rav in Latvia, in Poland, before World War II, and I'll be elaborating on his thought a little bit, adding some aspects of it, but the basic idea is in his Sefer Hadrash for Ian, and he says the following. The whole purpose, as I said before, of the quarantine is to give the Mitzorah the opportunity to reflect, to think about the damage that he's done, to recognize the consequences of his Aveirot, and this in turn inspires a person to do tshuva, to rectify his actions, and when he eventually rejoins society, he will do so in a constructive way. But when we are confronted with evidence of our sin, the tzarat is kind of God's mark of Cain, that there's something you need to correct, we immediately move into different modalities in which we try to look for excuses to avoid the introspection that tshuva entails. Right? We always seek avoidance, mitigation. And there are three types of psychological excuses we give ourselves when we are confronted with evidence of our shortcomings. Defense mechanism number one is denial. We simply refuse to acknowledge that we did anything wrong. In the case of Lashon Hara, we might say things like, but it was true, which of course is not a defense at all, because Lashon Hara is forbidden even though it's true, but a person might say, everything I said was true. Or something like, he deserved it. Or, he's much worse than I said. Or, he hurt me, so I'm hitting back. We'll call that denial, because the person is refusing to acknowledge to himself he did anything wrong. Tshuva obviously cannot exist until a person is at least honest to himself. We're not talking about confessing to others. But without honesty to myself, that I messed up, I did something wrong, how am I going to change? So, one way that denial could be described in English is the term whitewashing. Whitewashing is you cover up your offense by making believe it's not a problem. The white hair, the black hair that turned white, in other words, the Mitzvah was in quarantine for 7 days. The Kohen examines him on day 7 to see, is he doing the tshuva process? And the same way God showed the sin through the nega, God is giving the Kohen, who after all cannot read the heart, some physical sign is a tshuva process proceeding. If the hair turned white, then the Torah effectively is telling the Mitzvah and the Kohen, this guy is still living in the world of whitewash and denial. Send him back. He needs more time. So that's why Sar Lavan is a Siman Tumah, because it is a heavenly statement that the person has not come to grips with the reality of their transgression. So that's one defense mechanism we have. There's another mechanism we have which almost works in the opposite direction. A person may be so hyper-conscious of their guilt that they feel they have reached a point of no return, and there's no point in even trying to do tshuva, because tshuva is impossible. This is what is called yeyush, giving up. This is the idea that I am so far gone that there's no way that God will ever forgive me, and therefore I might as well keep going. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we shall die. That is exemplified by the second siman of Tumah. The nega spreads. The rot spreads. It does not spread because of indifference. It spreads because of a loss of hope that positive change is ever possible. So again, it's the same dynamic. I come to the Kohen on day 7. The Kohen has to inspect me. If the hair turned white, that means I'm living in denial. Go back and think about it. And the same thing happens the second week. If the nega spreads, I'm in hopelessness. The Kohen's message is, think about this some more. The pathways of tshuva are always open. Then there's a third thing that we do. We have all sorts of mind games to kind of get us out of the confrontation. And that is, a person, perhaps because if they do think about it, they'll become overwhelmed with guilt, simply emotionally does not allow themselves to go there. Meaning, they're not in active denial in which they convince themselves they're right, nor are they overwhelmed with guilt, but they simply say, I'm not going there. I'm not going to allow my mind to dwell upon it. Meaning to say, in the recesses of my heart, I will keep it out. Sometimes, at least in the short term, that actually might be a necessary strategy for self-preservation. That's really a talk for another time, in which sometimes a person is not yet ready to confront, and therefore you need to build on your strengths in other areas. But that is the third siman of Tumah, the healthy flesh. The healthy flesh basically says, even if I'm surrounded by rot of Lashon Hara, I will not allow it to penetrate the inner dimensions of my being. Once again, the Kohen says to the person, spend some time working this out. Now, if there's a siman tumah, that is a sign that the tshuva process has not really begun. But if after 2 weeks you still have the nega, the sin of Lashon Hara is still there, but you don't have the denial, you don't have the hopelessness, and you don't have the emotional distancing, at that point, the Kohen can say to the guy, you're still sick, but you can go home and work on it. because the process of tshuva is proceeding apace. And that explains what otherwise is an anomaly. The guy goes home even though he still has the leprosy, again, proof that it's not contagious disease, because without the siman tumah, he's not utilizing the mechanisms that prevent a person from doing tshuva. And therefore, he is able to go home. Right? So that's what the siman tumah is. It's a very, very ingenious, beautiful interpretation that the simanim of tumah are kind of the miniyot, the things that hold us back from tshuva. Denial, hopelessness, and inability or lack of desire to grapple with the issue. Meaning, even if I'm not in active denial, I just don't want to go there. And again, I want to emphasize, again, this deserves more elaboration than I can give it, that at least the last one is sometimes necessary. In other words, I'm not going to call the last one bad, but until you're able to deal with it, the process of tshuva can never be completed. So I would differentiate the third one from the other two. Denial, hopelessness are never really positive responses. Deciding to put something on the back burner sometimes may be a necessary response, but by definition it's an incomplete response, because until you confront it, you're not able to go beyond it. Okay, so that is the meaning of the simanei tumah and why they are relevant to the purification of the leprosy process. Now, what's interesting is, we just finished Paysach, to a little more than a week ago, and it's interesting that the three simanim of tumah actually correspond to different aspects of chametz. Like the one thing we know about Paysach is, of course, chametz bad, matzah good. Right? Paysach is the one time of year where we don't have chametz, we don't have leavened stuff. And there are different interpretations of what chametz represents. Obviously, in terms of the biblical narrative, not eating chametz is a historical commemoration of the fact that when the Israelites left Egypt, they had to leave in such a hurry, both in terms of God pushing them out and the Egyptians pushing them out, that they couldn't let their dough rise. They had to bake it as unleavened bread. And therefore we commemorate the chipazon, the hurriedness by which we left Mitzrayim, by not eating chametz and only eating matzah. The Arizal explains, a very famous teaching of the Arizal, that we are on the 49th level of impurity. If we would have hit the 50th level, we would have been irredeemable, and therefore God had to take us out even within the few minutes that it takes for dough to rise and become chametz, which is only 18 minutes, because in those few minutes we would have hit level 50, and that would have been it. So obviously the primary understanding of chametz and matzah is that it is a commemoration of the historical circumstances of the Exodus. And yet we find, certainly even in the Gemara and certainly in the writings of the Kabbalists, that chametz and matzah have deeper symbols as well. We are told, for example, that seor, leaven, represents the yetzer hara, the evil inclination. And when you burn the chametz, you're also talking about destroying the yetzer hara, to have a more pure relationship with God. In fact, for many years, I don't know what they did this year because of Corona, but for many years the largest Seder in the world was the Chabad Seder in Kathmandu, in Nepal. A few thousand people, most of whom were Israelis actually, who liked to backpack and the like. And because the population are largely not religious, so they have to be a little avant-garde. So on Erev Pesach they have a very interesting ritual that when they burn the chametz, every person is asked to write on a piece of paper some negative character trait that they would like to get rid of, their arrogance, their anger, and they burn that with the chametz. Now that may sound avant-garde, that may sound hippie-ish, that may sound so 60s, but in truth, it very much resonates with the Kabbalistic understanding that chametz is yetzer hara. But in particular, of all of the attributes of yetzer hara that chametz represents, The one that is most identified with chametz is that of arrogance, because chametz rises, it's puffed up. It represents conceit, arrogance, hubris, as opposed to matzah, which is flat and simple and represents humility. So symbol number one of chametz equals yetzer hara. Yetzer hara equals arrogance and gaiva. That actually corresponds to the white hair, because often a person denies that they're in the wrong because of their arrogance. I am too proud to admit that I made a mistake. I am too proud to say that I'm at fault. So in a sense, the same way the sar lavan, the white hair, the black hair that turns white, connotes denial. Denial itself is connected to arrogance. And therefore, the sar lavan corresponds to the first meaning of chametz, that chametz represents gaiva. Now, there are two other meanings of chametz that the Meforshim give us. The Maharal points out that chametz spoils, it rots, right? If you take chametz and you just leave it around, it gets mold. In fact, that's how you get penicillin. It gets moldy. Matzah can stay for 1,000 years, right? I think we have matzah from Masada or something, still, sometimes shmor matzah hayit. Right, it seems to be from there and the like. But matzah does not spoil. Chametz spoils. So, the second association with chametz and matzah is rat. Rat corresponds to the second siman of the Metzorah, where the nega spreads. That's an inner rat where, because of hopelessness and despondency, you feel you can never improve your situation. So you keep on rotting in the commission of that sin, degenerating further and further and further. So the sar lavan corresponds to the arrogance message of chametz. The pisayon corresponds to the spreading of the nega, corresponds to the hopelessness of the rat of chametz. And then we have a third understanding of chametz that the Maharal advances, and he points out that a difference between chametz and matzah is that chametz happens automatically. By that I mean, if water hits flour, you don't have to do anything. You don't need a starter. You don't need yeast, contrary to what people think. Water and flour will automatically produce chametz without the need of any supplementary action. So chametz represents inertia, paralysis, not moving forward. Matzah, on the other hand, requires that action be taken. Right? The whole theory of halacha is that when you bake a dough, you have stopped the fermentation process. If you don't bake the dough, fermentation will occur within 18 minutes. Well, so that's the third association, right? Our first association was chametz is arrogance. Our second association was chametz is rot and spoilage. And our third association is chametz is inertia and paralysis. That corresponds to the third siman of emotional distancing. That's the clean, healthy flesh in which you don't allow yourself to be inspired, you don't allow yourself to move. So it's very, very interesting that Parshas Metzorah is normally read typically the second Shabbos after Paysach, sometimes even the first Shabbos after Paysach. And although we're no longer thinking about chametz and matzah that much, but in a sense it comes back to haunt us in a different guise, that the three simanim of Metzorah come back to remind us of the three meanings of the message of chametz and matzah. I just want to point out that obviously this week we observed Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day, And this is a day that actually the actual date is a little controversial because we are still in the month of Nisan, and in the month of Nisan we normally don't mourn, so there were certain controversies about Yom HaShoah in the month of Nisan, but Lamaisa, the reason why the date was chosen was because it does commemorate the fall of the Warsaw Ghetto, which was an example of outstanding heroism, standing up for the Jewish people against the Nazis, although it resulted in, unfortunately, the destruction of the ghetto and the Jews that lived in the ghetto. But it's very important for us to understand that when we think about the Holocaust, we shouldn't only think about tragedy. We shouldn't only think about destruction, but we should think about the nobility and the inspiration of the spiritual heroism of Jews, who, in spite of the fact that they lost everything, continued to believe in God, continued to sanctify God. Even the people who went to their deaths because they didn't have the ability to fight did so with a nobility. And we have to remember that, yes, they died as Jews, but certainly many of them lived as Jews as well. And we have to take an example not only from their deaths, but from their lives as well. And almost all of us have lost relatives in the Holocaust, and we should think about them, and we should resolve that, the expression goes, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And if we don't endeavor in our own lives to preserve the Torah and live as Jews and build Eretz Yisrael and have Avat Yisrael, then God forbid we are doing to ourselves what Hitler was not able to do to our ancestors. So Yehi Zichram Baruch, may their blessing be in memory, and may we endeavor to follow their role model and live lives of Kiddush Hashem. Thank you, and Kol Tov.